She wore scrubs. She carried a stethoscope. Parents trusted her with the smallest, most fragile lives in the hospital. For over a year, something was killing babies on a neonatal ward in the northwest of England, and no one could explain why. By the time anyone stopped to ask the right question, 7 infants were dead, and 7 more had survived attacks on their lives. The woman responsible for the worst string of infant killings in modern British history wasn't a stranger. She was the nurse standing at their bedside. This is the story of Lucy Letby. Lucy Letby was born in 1990 in Hereford, England, an only child raised in what neighbors and former classmates would later describe as an ordinary, unremarkable household. She trained as a children's nurse at the University of Chester, graduating in 2011, and by early 2012 she had joined the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, a mid-sized NHS hospital serving a working-class corner of northwest England near the Welsh border. Neonatal units like the one at the Countess of Chester care for the most vulnerable patients in any hospital: premature babies, infants with birth complications, newborns whose bodies are still learning how to survive outside the womb. It is a specialty that demands both technical skill and enormous emotional resilience, because loss is, unfortunately, sometimes part of the job. Letby rose steadily through the unit. Colleagues described her as competent, well-liked, and dedicated. The kind of nurse who volunteered for extra shifts and seemed genuinely invested in her young patients. She babysat for some colleagues' children. She sent condolence cards to grieving families. By outward appearances, she was unremarkable in the best possible sense. A reliable professional doing difficult, important work. Nothing in this early picture, and this matters for how the story unfolds, gave any public indication of what investigators would later allege was happening behind the scenes. Before we go further into how this case unraveled, if you're new here, consider subscribing. We cover major criminal cases like this one, with a focus on verified facts and courtroom evidence, not speculation. Now, back to the story. Between June 2015 and June 2016, the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital experienced a sharp and unusual rise in infant deaths and unexplained medical collapses. In a unit that might typically see a small number of deaths per year, consultants began noticing babies who had been stable, sometimes improving, suddenly crash without clear medical explanation. Doctors on the ward started to notice something else. Lucy Letby's name kept appearing in connection with these incidents. She was frequently the nurse on shift when a baby collapsed. In some cases, she was the one who raised the alarm. In others, colleagues noted she had inserted herself into the care of infants she wasn't formally assigned to. By mid-2015 and into 2016, a group of senior consultant pediatricians, including Dr. Stephen Brary and Dr. Ravi Jayaram, began raising concerns internally. They approached hospital management, asking questions about the statistical improbability of so many collapses correlating with one nurse's shift pattern. It's important to be precise here about what happened next, because it became one of the most controversial parts of the entire case. Hospital executives, according to evidence later presented to a public inquiry, were slow to act. Some doctors say their concerns were dismissed or downplayed for months. Letby continued working on the unit, including in clinical roles, during part of this period, even after doctors had asked that she be removed. In July 2016, Letby was finally moved off frontline clinical duties and reassigned to administrative work. It was only after this reassignment that the unit's death rate returned to a more typical baseline, a fact that would later become a significant, if circumstantial, thread in the prosecution's case. In May 2017, Cheshire Constabulary launched a formal investigation, which became known as Operation Hummingbird. This was not a small undertaking. Detectives, working alongside independent medical experts, began the painstaking process of reviewing dozens of infant cases, medical charts, staffing rotas, blood test results, and hospital records, spanning more than a year of care on the unit. The investigation was, notably, slow and methodical rather than reactive. It took roughly 2 years of evidence gathering before police made an arrest. Letby was first arrested in July 2018 on suspicion of murder, then released on bail while the investigation continued. She was arrested again in 2019 and a third time in 2020 as the scope of the police case expanded to cover additional infants. Throughout this period, Letby was not formally charged. This is a distinction worth holding on to. An arrest is not a conviction, and the presumption of innocence remained a legal reality for Letby throughout this multi-year investigative phase, however damning the emerging pattern appeared to investigators. In November 2020, the Crown Prosecution Service formally charged Letby with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder relating to infants under her care between 2015 and 2016. If you're finding this breakdown helpful, drop a like. It genuinely helps this kind of factual, court-based coverage reach more people. Now let's get into the trial itself. Letby's trial began in October 2022 at Manchester Crown Court and became the longest-running murder trial in British legal history, lasting nearly 10 months. The jury heard evidence relating to the deaths of 7 infants and non-fatal attacks on 7 others. The prosecution's case rested on several pillars, and it's important to separate what was evidence presented at trial from broader commentary that circulated in the press. First, there was a statistical pattern. Prosecutors presented a now-famous chart showing that Letby was the only staff member on duty for every one of the collapses and deaths in question, a correlation the prosecution argued was too consistent to be coincidental. It's worth noting this chart itself became a point of later scientific criticism, which we'll return to. Second, there was medical evidence. Expert witnesses for the prosecution, including consultant pediatrician Dr. Dewey Evans, testified that certain infants had died or collapsed in ways consistent with deliberate harm, including allegations of intentional air embolism, air injected into the bloodstream, insulin poisoning, and force-feeding of milk into infants' airways. Blood tests on 2 babies allegedly showed abnormal insulin and C-peptide levels, which prosecutors argued indicated deliberate insulin poisoning rather than a naturally occurring medical condition. Third, there was circumstantial and documentary evidence. Handwritten notes found during a police search of Letby's home, including one in which she wrote, "I am evil. I did this," alongside other fragmented, distressed writings. The prosecution presented these as an implicit admission of guilt. The defense argued they reflected the emotional breakdown of a nurse being blamed, rightly or wrongly, for tragedies she did not cause, a common reaction, they argued, to overwhelming stress and false accusation. Fourth, prosecutors pointed to Letby's own search history and behavior, including that she had searched online for the Facebook profiles of victims' families on multiple occasions after their infants had died or been harmed, which they argued showed an unusual, fixated interest in her alleged victims. In August 2023, the jury convicted Letby of murdering 7 babies and the attempted murder of 6 others, with 2 attempts against 1 infant. She was cleared on some counts, and the jury could not reach a verdict on a handful of others. She received a whole life order, meaning she will never be eligible for parole. In 2024, following a retrial on 1 remaining count, she was convicted of a further attempted murder and given a 15th whole life term. Lucy Letby maintained her innocence throughout the investigation, trial, and to the present day. She did not testify to having harmed any infant, and her defense team argued the prosecution's case was built on coincidence, dressed up as pattern, and correlation, mistaken for causation. Her defense argued that neonatal units caring for the sickest, most premature infants inevitably see clusters of deaths and collapses, and that a nurse who worked more shifts than colleagues, or who was present during a period of unusually poor unit conditions, including understaffing and estate problems that were raised separately in hospital reports, would statistically appear more often at the scene of bad outcomes without that presence being causal. On the medical evidence, the defense called its own experts to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of insulin levels, and to argue that some babies' collapses were consistent with known complications of prematurity, sepsis, or pre-existing conditions, rather than deliberate harm. The The jury heard both sides at length before reaching its verdicts. It is a fact that Letby chose to give evidence in her own defense during the trial, denying every allegation against her. The jury's guilty verdicts, delivered in August 2023 and supplemented by the 2024 retrial verdict, resulted in Lucy Letby receiving 15 whole-life orders in total, the most severe sentence available under English law, reserved for the small number of cases judges consider to be of exceptional severity. She is currently held at HMP Bronzefield, a high-security women's prison. The trial judge, Mr. Justice Goss, described her crimes as a cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder, carried out by someone in whom the parents of her victims had placed complete trust. For the families involved, the trial forced them to relive the deaths or near deaths of their children in exhaustive clinical detail across nearly a year of testimony. Several parents gave victim impact statements describing the devastation of learning that their child's death, which they had been told was a tragic but natural event, may have been a deliberate act. For the Countess of Chester Hospital, the case exposed a serious institutional failure. Multiple senior doctors have said publicly that their concerns were raised months before Letby was finally removed from clinical duties, and that hospital executives were reluctant to escalate the matter, reportedly out of concern for reputational damage and the seriousness of what an allegation against a staff member would imply. This delay has become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the entire case, separate from the question of Letby's guilt itself. In response, the UK government established a statutory public inquiry, chaired by Lady Justice Kate Thirlwall, examining the broader circumstances, how hospital management responded to concerns, whether NHS whistleblowing protections functioned as intended, and what safeguards should change to prevent a similar failure in the future. This inquiry does not revisit Letby's guilt or innocence. Its scope is institutional, not evidentiary. The case has also had a wider chilling effect across the UK healthcare system, prompting renewed debate about how hospitals investigate internal concerns about staff, and how to balance protecting whistleblowing doctors with the risk of unfounded allegations against healthcare workers. Quick reminder if you're still with us, subscribing helps support deep dive coverage like this, and we always appreciate it. Here it's essential to be precise about what is settled fact and what remains contested. What is legally established? Lucy Letby was convicted by a jury, twice, following 2 separate trials, of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder 7 others. She has twice applied for leave to appeal her convictions to the Court of Appeal, and both applications were refused, most recently in 2024. No conviction has been overturned, and the guilty verdicts remain the legal position as of this recording. What remains actively disputed? In the time since her convictions, a number of statisticians, neonatologists, and journalists have publicly questioned aspects of the prosecution's medical and statistical evidence. A panel of international neonatal specialists, organized by one of Letby's supporters, concluded that in their view the medical evidence did not support the conclusion that the infants had been deliberately harmed, and argued that natural causes, prematurity, infection, and pre-existing conditions better explain the deaths. Some critics have also challenged the reliability of the insulin test results used at trial. One of the prosecution's own expert witnesses has since said he revised his opinion on the cause of death for at least 1 baby. Letby's legal team, led by barrister Mark MacDonald, has submitted an application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the independent body responsible for investigating potential miscarriages of justice in England and Wales, asking that the case be referred back to the Court of Appeal. As of this recording, that review remains ongoing, with no fixed timeline for a decision, and the Crown Prosecution Service has confirmed no further charges will be pursued against her. It is important to state clearly, none of this constitutes a legal finding that Letby is innocent, nor has any court ruled the convictions unsafe. It reflects an active, unresolved public and scientific debate that sits alongside, but does not currently overturn, the jury's verdicts on Shelley. The case of Lucy Letby forces an uncomfortable question that has no easy answer. How do you build a system that protects vulnerable patients from the rare person who might harm them, without casting suspicion on the vast majority of healthcare workers who dedicate their lives to saving them? Whatever the outcome of future legal reviews, what remains constant is the grief of the families at the center of this case. Parents who trusted a hospital and a nurse with the most fragile moments of their children's lives. Their loss is not a subject of debate. Whatever else about this case continues to be argued in courtrooms and headlines for years to come. If this case raises questions for you, we'd encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. But we'd ask that you do so respectfully, keeping in mind that real families are affected by how this story continues to be told. If you want more in-depth, fact-checked coverage of major criminal cases, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And as always, thank you for watching.